Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. This podcast is all about church planting in the Canadian context. So whether you are a church planter, a pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or someone just wanting to learn more about Canadian church planting, we believe this podcast is for you. We pray this is a blessing to you, and if it is, we'd ask you to share links to episodes, subscribe on whatever platform you're using. With that, let's get to our next conversation. Welcome back, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. It is a joy to have you listening again to conversations about church planting in the Canadian context. I trust the first interview that I engaged with Jeff Christopherson, was a blessing to you, and I'm excited for the episode that we're going to get to today. We will be looking more specifically at making disciples. It's likely no surprise to you if you are listening to this podcast that we are talking, and church planting is really about fulfilling the Great Commission. What is the Great Commission? Well, we find it in Matthew 28, verses 18 to 20, where Jesus came and said to his disciples, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." Now, every church, at least every pastor that I've met, certainly the church that I pastored and planted, we thought a lot about this. What does it look to make disciples? But every church makes decisions that sometimes encourage disciple making, and at other times subconsciously, whether we realize it or not, may even discourage disciple making. And so the episode today, we're really looking at disciple making in the context of church planting. And to do that, we are going to, and you are going to be hearing from someone by the name of Robin Wallar. Robin is the pastor of Lift Church in Hamilton, Ontario. He's written a couple of books. One is called Everyone Sent to Multiply Everything. His second book is called Living Sent. Robin is a software engineer. You'll hear a little bit more in a bit about his software company and resources that he is developing for churches about disciple making. Robin is inspiring. I'm sure you'll be inspired as you hear this interview that I had with him. And I'm just really excited that Robin was willing to jump onto this podcast and to be interviewed. Once again, if this podcast is an encouragement to you, I would encourage you to share it. You can find us on the web at www.thesowerspod.ca. You can find us on Instagram at thesowerspod, on Twitter, or X as it's now called, the Sowers Pod. And if you have any questions that you'd like us to answer here on the podcast, or if you have any comments about any of the episodes so far, I would encourage you to either email ask@thesowerspod.ca, or you can mention on either Instagram or Twitter. And now to my interview with Robin Wallar. Robin, thank you for joining me on the second episode of the Sowers Podcast. We're here in the ministry center for Lift Church. Could you describe this ministry center for me? What it is, what its purpose for? Go ahead.
Yeah, so this building we built as basically a giant hangout space for our church. It's located in the heart of the neighborhood where at least those of us that are here in Hamilton live. We all live within walking distance of the building. And we set it up and built it from scratch to serve as a space that our community can use to make disciples, to cook meals together, to hang out together, to play games together. And so it's a building that is filled with people basically Monday to Saturday, and then empty on Sundays when we go and gather in other places to bring people together. And so it's got a place for studying and hanging out. It's got like a cafe space. It's got a studio in the basement. We have a big operations center. So our team that is supporting our churches that are scattered all over Ontario work out of this space, resourcing, developing content, providing all the back end systems to support our church planting efforts. But really the main thing that we built it for was to facilitate relationships and connection in our church. Our church is a little bit unique in that we're geographically all over the place. We're scattered over a fairly large area and increasingly a larger area. But sometimes when people would join our plants, which might be like 5 people, like really, really small, they would join and there was sort of this sense of like, is this thing, like, does it have substance? Can I trust it? And what we've seen is that by having a physical space, even though it's not a traditional church in any real sense of the word, or church building, I should say, it has given people a sense of permanence, even though they might be like 2 hours from this building. And so it sort of says, okay, this thing has some longevity, it has some substance. If a bank's willing to give us a mortgage, maybe I can, and they think they're going to be around for 25 years. Okay, maybe I can trust it. And so it's really been interesting because the benefit that we've seen from this is not just like geographically local to us. It's also facilitating church planting far away. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot more I could say to it, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of churches have the desire that if they have a physical space, that it would be used Monday to Saturday. But can you describe, because that is the case here, so can you describe how you've facilitated a culture where the building is not a place for one day a week, but it's truly a 24/7 use throughout the rest of the week? What did you have to do in its design, in its purpose, and even in the way that you're thinking about this church being a church?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways it's rooted in the values and the principles that are broader than the building. And how we think about what it means to be a church. So I'll give you an example. One of the core values, not like on paper, but one of the things we really cherish as a church is sharing meals together and eating together and being together every day of the week. Like that's something that's really important to us. And so we designed the building from the get-go to facilitate something that we were already doing. We were already eating together every day. We were already cooking meals and feeding hundreds of people a week out of homes, and it was really chaotic. And so when we designed it, we said, okay, let's put a kitchen in that has like multiple ovens and is set up to support a large number of people. And then we just said, we gave everybody the key. And so literally every leader in our church has access to the building. It sounds like a small thing, but we put these the whole thing's keypad entry. And what that means is that we can just hand out access to the building. And a lot of people would say, oh man, there's a lot of risk with that. Aren't they going to abuse it? I'm like, yeah, they might break it. They might wear it out. They might, do something wrong. But what if they discover the joy of community? What if I think sometimes churches can be very like risk averse with our physical assets. And I think what we've kind of said is let's just take lots of risk. Let's empower people to use it however they want, whatever would best support them. So on the first week of the building, a bunch of our lights were smashed because people were throwing basketballs irresponsibly. Rather than clamping down on it, we said, thank you guys. We're so glad you're here playing basketball. And we put the lights back up and tried to design a system so that they wouldn't break. And we encouraged them and thanked them. So it's sort of this value of togetherness, this value of life-on-life relationship, the value of sharing meals and being together. And then the space is just an extension of that. Another way to think about it is that the space is essentially copying what we're already doing in our homes. So we teach our church a lot about this principle of open home, living life together. And hopefully that's what's happening. They're inviting their neighbors over, people they know, people they don't know. We're cooking meals, we're hanging out, we're doing babysitting activities, like whatever. And then when we created a space, we just said, everything you're doing, do it in this space if you can, or if it would benefit you. That was part of it. And the other, I think, key thing we did at the outset was we just listened. we went to all of our leaders and said, what do you want out of the space? What would benefit you? And then we built what they asked us to build. And as a result, they were really excited about it. And then the other thing is that they built the space. Literally, we had all of our house church or small group leaders coming in. They did the renovations. They cook it. And then the final thought I would share is that we don't have a janitor. Instead, our house churches rotate cleaning the building. It's a pretty large building, about 7,000 square feet. There's a lot of different spaces. It gets used a ton. So cleaning it is actually a big challenge. But by having the community take ownership for the space versus contracting it out or hiring it out, every week, like just last week, I met a girl. She'd joined our church on Sunday. For the first time, she was cleaning the building on Tuesday with a group of other girls. And rather than feeling like this is weird, she was like, "This is incredible. I get to take ownership. If I'm part of this church, I get to have access to a space." And so, little decisions like that have been fairly important and strategic in the process of cultivating ownership.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've started sort of with the end in mind, and certainly by end, I don't mean the end of Lift Church, but just currently where we are now, because I think the culture that's been created transcends this building.
Mm-hmm.
So take us back to when God got a hold of Robin Wallar and the journey of Lift Church now being what Lift Church is. As you said, this is just one of the locations of Lift Church. None of your other locations have a building, but there's a culture, there's churches, there are people in other places. Mm-hmm. Where'd this all start?
Yeah, so for me personally, I grew up in this crazy church planting movement in South Africa as a boy, and was exposed very early to people that were passionate about what God was doing and willing to give their life to it. When we immigrated to Canada, when I was 9, we jumped into another church plant, and my parents modeled for me a life of sort of bivocational, or being a professional, but also investing into the church in a significant way very, very early on. And so I was exposed to seeing God move in incredible ways, but also doing it mostly through just ordinary people, just regular followers of Jesus that were willing to do what might be considered extreme things. And over that time, God brought people into my life that discipled me and taught me how to read the Bible, how to pray, how to do evangelism, how to make disciples myself. And they were just ordinary people. Like one of my, the disciplers in my life that influenced me the most was a kindergarten teacher in her 40s when I was a teenager. And she just said, "Robin, she just poured into my life and gave me space to go and fail and try stuff." And so we have this, for me at a personal level, this absolute conviction in the priesthood of all believers, that God has commissioned us to go and make disciples of all nations. And he intends to use all people to do that. That there isn't this, multi-class system in the church. The called and the not quite so called, the special and this, sort of not as special, the professional and the not professional. But rather that God moves through ordinary people, and that when we call ordinary people to do extraordinary things for the kingdom, amazing, amazing things can happen. And so that idea somehow embedded into my heart through all of those experiences in a pretty deep way. Our church, incidentally, when my wife and I took over leading our church about 11 years ago, we were really small. It was about 20 people. It had declined. It had kind of lost its way. We had no money. We had nothing. We certainly didn't have a building or any resources. And the decision was we can either shut it down. This is after about 6 years. So after 6 years, we were at 20 people. So for anyone that's listening, if they ever feel like they're failing because they're not hitting the metrics, sometimes the long, slow road of faithfulness is what God calls us to. And so my wife and I were sitting there. I was working as a software engineer. My wife was working in public relations. And we just said, we'll lead the church and we'll do it for free. We don't need a job. We don't need to be paid. We'll make disciples. And by virtue of the fact that we both had jobs, I was living in Hamilton, commuting to Richmond Hill every day. So that's like an hour and 20-minute commute each way. So time was really tight. And so sometimes we would do like an early morning 6 a.m. meeting, hop in the car, drive. And so what we had to do was we had to figure out, okay, like let's take that principle of calling people to the priesthood of all believers that I had embodied in my own life and start empowering others to do that. And so that's what we did. We just empowered our church to take ownership for the church, to make disciples, to try initiatives. And our church kind of blew up in a really positive way. It grew really quickly as people realized that God had a call on their life and that they could do amazing and incredible work in disciple making in our context. And so if you give that another, over the last 10 years, we've really worked and refined that idea and experimented with it to try to figure out, okay, how can we take that principle, the priesthood of all believers, the call to make disciples, and use it to plant churches. So, yeah.
And I remember in past conversations, you shared how at some stage you discovered that some of the things you were hoping for in the life of the church, as far as its growth, the priesthood of all believers, that your model or the way that it was going about was hindering that. Could you describe a bit of that journey to those that are listening?
Yeah. So, no journey is straightforward and linear. We've had our ups and downs. And, I said a moment ago that we grew really quickly, but there was a price to be paid for that growth. And the price was that we really had no infrastructure. Although I had kind of captured some of these ideas in my heart, I didn't know how to articulate them. I didn't have the language or the words, and I certainly didn't know how to do it at scale. How do you deploy hundreds of disciple makers? Like, practically, how does that look? And so, and a lot of the reason our church was growing was because we were fairly attractional. We had good music, we had decent preaching, and it had sort of become the it thing in town. And so we kind of faced this quandary of we had lots of people, but we hadn't thought clearly about what we were doing. And what really exposed the gap for us was when we started to try to church plant. Because rather than taking church planters that we had raised and developed, I made the grave mistake of just hiring someone to plant a church for us. And, brilliant, smart, passionate, talented people. But we didn't have clarity around who we were. We didn't have alignment around who we were. And so when we planted basically replicating what was basically an attractional strategy. And it fell on its face really bad. We didn't see the same growth we were experiencing. The costs were really high to keep something like that running, like the worship and the speaking and all that. And we started but at the same time, the Lord was putting a passion in us to say, we want to plant lots and lots and lots of churches. And so we realized that the methodology we were using was not scalable. It was too expensive. And it wasn't rooted in a multiplying mindset, in that we weren't raising and sending out our own leaders. We were trying to import them off somebody else's work. And so about 5 years ago, we essentially threw it all out and started again and moved basically back to what we had done at the very beginning. We said, okay, what if we plant churches by starting with small house churches of people that are just regular professionals that love Jesus, know how to make disciples, and can do the basics of evangelism. And rather than paying them, they'll go get a job, they'll move to a city, and they'll just start slow. And we restructured all of our churches onto that basic paradigm. All of our churches are now led bivocationally, other than a central support team that's supporting them. And it's been an incredible journey because rather than the big show being at the front, now it's lots and lots and lots and lots of decentralized discipleship relationships. And the part that for me is the most encouraging, and this is something I was chatting with one of our young leaders this week. I said to him, I feel like I couldn't stop this thing if I wanted to. And he looked at me and said, no, man, like, we're making disciples, whether or not you tell us to. And it was there that I felt like, okay, after 5 years of work, we finally are hitting a place where it's like, now this is bigger than Lift Church. This is bigger than an idea in my head. It's like we have disciples that have caught the vision of disciple making and church planting, and they're just going to go do it. And so now we're kind of experiencing this place of, okay, how do we come alongside that passion and try to resource it and encourage it? And so it's been a fun journey.
I think there's a lot of people that desire that to be the case, to be said of their church. What are, let's say, 3 things that you think you did? You could say more than 3, but what are some things that you had done leadership-wise intentionally to begin building that sort of culture to the point now where it would just happen regardless of Robin's involvement or not?
So I think the first thing we did is that we got really, really clear on our core values. And I think a lot of times values are aspirational. But what we tried to do is we wrote down, like, what is the one thing we want to be really good at? And we wrote it down 5 years ago. We said, we want to be really good at multiplying disciples. And if something in our church family is not supporting multiplying disciples, we stopped it. And that's a painful decision. We lost half the church. Half our church left.
So give an example of a decision that you had to make that led to that pain, but why it was identifying that value of multiplying leaders.
I'll tell it through a conversation I had. We were trying to figure out how to get people to do evangelism. And we had, at that point, this is now 5 years ago, we had a very successful, very large women's ministry. It was well known. Lots of people would attend. But what was happening is that it was centralizing into a few people that were kind of running events and lots of people consuming events. And we realized that there was no actual life-on-life discipleship happening. It was consuming a ton of resources, a lot of oxygen in the room, but not actually serving to do the life-on-life discipleship. And I had a conversation with someone. They said, well, Robin, if we don't do this women's ministry, how are we going to lead people to Jesus? And I looked at that young woman and I said, you are. Like, you're going to do it. And everybody else is going to do it. And we're not going to build it around superstars. We're going to build it around ordinary people. And so we shut it down and we said, everyone is going to be in a discipleship relationship with somebody else. Absolutely every person. No more big events that are not facilitating discipleship, period. That was not very popular. But that decision to figure out what was important to us and then use it as like a scalpel to help us slice out the things that were not contributing to that core value. I think that the pain, like, I lost a lot of really good friends over that. Got a lot of hate mail. It was, if I'm honest, the most painful 2 years of my wife and I's life. Both of us ended up in counseling afterwards to process the pain. And yet I would do it again 100 times over. Challenging the status quo of what we were doing was hard, but it was worth it. And it was financial. It's a true story. I wasn't actually drawing any salary at the point in time. I was still working full time as an engineer. And the Lord says, okay, like, restructure, like, form it around these values. Oh, and quit your job and do this full time. And so everybody leaves. We had like a ton of finance walk out the door. And now, Lord, you want me to quit my job and do this? Like, at the point where we're at our financial weakest, my leadership credibility is at its weakest. And I was like, yeah. And so, yeah, we did. And that was a wild journey. And God has taken care of us along the way. So that's one of the things.
Friends, we will get back to my interview with Robin Wallar in just a moment. Before we do that, however, I want to let you know about Robin's software company called Engage Spaces. Engage Spaces is a software platform purpose-built for discipleship and church planting movements. Engage Spaces enables movements to expand their reach by automatically tracking and facilitating how everyone is involved and engaged. Engage Spaces is an all-in-one platform with powerful features customized to your team, including collaboration, event registrations, online learning, video calling, project management, and engagement activity and tracking. Say goodbye to messy software systems and hello to unity with Engage Spaces. Check out engagespaces.com for more information. Once again, that is engagespaces.com for more. What was then a second decision you made? So the first one was to be really clear 5 years ago, we are all about multiplying disciples.
Yeah. The second one is we built systems. We figured out, okay, how are we going to do that? We built a system that was designed to help us make disciples, essentially to make sure that everyone was in a discipleship relationship and that every set of relationships was involved in some form of evangelism. And we then wrote that down and started teaching it. And for the better part of 2 years, I was writing and teaching this system every week. We tried all kinds of different things. We did like a discipleship webcast, a podcast. We did courses. We did weekend retreats, anything we could to try to just communicate, like articulate a system and communicate. A couple books came out of that that are now core in articulating who we are as a church, and have been a blessing to others beyond us. And that system that was really, really key, the system thinking. But what's also important in it is that it was iterative. It's not like we designed the system and then just have executed it. We designed it and then we threw it out, we redesigned it. And I think we've redesigned it like 6 times, each time iterating and tweaking how we think about organizing disciple making, and each time hopefully making it a little bit better.
Was there a third?
So the third one, I think, maybe ties with the first one for challenging, is that we started to, I'd say confront, might be the right word, the expectations of the normal Christian life. I think that there's a lot of Christians in North America that have essentially adopted a mentality which is that being a Christian means maybe reading our Bible, being a part of a church, hopefully raising our kids to also follow the Lord. But other than that, basically living like everybody else around us. You know, we're good people. Hopefully we're the nicest people on the block. And that's kind of it. And yet when we read the scriptures and we started looking at like, what does it really mean to be a Christian? We realized it's actually really, really radical. And the call to following Jesus, to quote Bonhoeffer, is the call to like come and die. And we realized that there was this idol of career that, well, I can't sacrifice my career in order to make disciples. I can't sacrifice my prospects at like a nice house in order to make disciples. I can't, I got to live a quote balanced life. And, when I look at every major character in the New Testament, they were not balanced in the sense that I think we often mean. Like most of them were, I think, fairly unstable in their living situations, and yet they were profoundly rooted in trusting Christ. Like Paul writes from prison, like I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. But he's not in a strong position when he writes that. And so we started to call our church to actually live differently, to intentionally live with less, to structure their careers to maximize disciple making and evangelism, to move into neighborhoods so that they could be around their disciples, to live simply and humbly financially so they could be more generous. all these things that I think we don't really want to talk about often in the church. And that was really key because what it did is it started to give our people a framework for thinking about their life that placed disciple making at the center rather than the fringes, but to do it while they had careers. I think that if you're, for example, a nurse goes to work and they have really important work they need to do, the work of nursing, and they can love and care for their patients. But what do they do when they go home? What's their call to, where does the call to make disciples? As a nurse, you're not going to make disciples likely with your patients. Maybe if they're a Christian, you'll get an opportunity to pray with them or something. But for the most part, you're nursing, and your job is there to nurse. And that's good and godly, and we should celebrate that. But what we need to do as churches, and what we've tried to do, is give a paradigm to think about, okay, what about the totality of my life? What do I do with all of my time and all of my resources? And how does that serve disciple making?
You mentioned a couple of resources that you developed in that time. One of those was Everyone Sent to Multiply Everything. Mm-hmm. Did that book come out of that season? And give us a little bit of a taste of what you're trying to articulate and what you have articulated in that book. I imagine there are people hearing this and going, oh, Robin, like, okay, you did it 4 or 5 years ago. Don't know if I'd want to do it. Like, from that book, like, what is the first place that they need to start?
Yeah, so that book basically outlined the 3 core things that we saw as being essential in terms of raising, multiplying, and multiplying leaders. And so the book basically talks about 3 axes of development. One is cultivating gospel fluency. So clear thinking about what is the gospel. And if we've learned anything, most people are illiterate when it comes to the gospel. Even people that have been in church their whole lives, they can't articulate the gospel. They're not fluent in it, not just in their ability to communicate it, but in terms of how it's formed their worldview. So we spend a lot of time in the book articulating why fluency in the gospel is important and how to actually define that and build a system for cultivating it. The second thing we talk about is creating leadership systems and structures and thinking about leadership from a everyone standpoint. And then the third was developing what we call multiplication power, which is the ability for leaders to multiply themselves. And it's connected to what they multiply, gospel fluency, and the structures they multiply within leadership. But a lot of it's character, how they think, how they approach life. And so we talk about those 3 axes within a broader theological framework that we lay out at the beginning of the book, where we talk about, everyone's called to make disciples. I should add that in that, we take a great deal of time to be clear on what is discipleship. We learned really quickly that discipleship is sort of this catch-all term that can be really ambiguous and hard for people to define. And so we take about 2 full chapters just to articulate, this is what we mean by discipleship.
So what do you mean by discipleship?
Yeah, great question. So we define discipleship as following and being transformed by Jesus while inviting, modeling, training, and empowering others to do likewise. And that definition is, although wordy, is intended to capture the wholeness of it. It's this transformational encounter in walking with Jesus, but it's also multiplying. To engage in disciple making without multiplying disciples is not discipleship. I think sometimes what we've done is we've thought about discipleship only as inner life transformation, like my sanctification journey, my being led towards Jesus. But if we're being led towards Jesus, that means we should also be connecting to and reproducing and participating in the mission of Jesus. And we can't separate those out and sort of treat them as even 2 steps. And so we wanted to be really clear about, okay, if we're going to make disciples, we actually have to reproduce. And that means we invite, we bring people in, we train, or so we model, so we show them our life, say, this is what a disciple looks like. Look at my life. We train, we equip with content and resources and a way of life. And then we say, okay, you go do it. And then that repeats.
So talk about that. Lift started here in Hamilton at McMaster, and now you're in other places. So talk to us about how that's happened.
Yeah, so it's been a very up and down journey. As I said, we started with one strategy, and what we're doing today is very different from that. But what we're doing now, and what's been like crazy incredible, is we just started to call our church to just ask everyone. Everyone needs to pray about church planting. So our baseline assumption is that everyone is called to plant some sort of a church. It might be like a tiny little house church with 5 people. Maybe it grows to something really big, but that our working unit of the church is really the house church in the home. And that is something that's accessible to everyone. Pretty much everybody can be a part of leading or at least contributing to that sort of minimal ecclesiological approach to church. And so we started calling our church to that. And then crazily, they started coming and saying, I feel like I need to go plant a church over there. So, my good friend Shane came to us and said, hey, I feel like I need to plant a church at the University of Toronto in Mississauga. And I kind of looked at him like, really, man? Like you're telling me you want to move to Mississauga? Now, no disrespect to anybody in Mississauga, but it's not somewhere I would want to go. And he's like, yeah, like I really feel like, most people are like, okay, you do the big cool downtown campus or, go somewhere fun. And he's like, we're going to go to this largely forgotten campus, forgotten context. He said, look, there's no churches there. And so he had just graduated from chemical engineering program at McMaster. He moves to Mississauga in the middle of COVID without a job. Because he felt called to. He assembled, put a little team together of 3 others, and prayed. Said, "Lord, I'm going to plant a church here. You got to give me a job." And for about 8 months, he was unemployed, just burning through savings. Eventually, the Lord provides a job. He's now married. His wife's now moved out there with him, and that church is thriving, completely 100% led. Bivocationally or co-vocationally. And that's the story of how we're approaching church planting. That's the story of what's happened in Guelph. We're on our way to London later this year. Credible young woman came and said, hey, I want to take what we're doing here in Hamilton. I want to take it somewhere else. To be honest, I don't think we could stop her. If we really asked her, she would. She's very teachable and humble. That's what makes her a great leader. But she's just like, I had to go. And so what we're trying to do is create an environment where people are asking the Holy Spirit, where do you want me to go? And then are part of a church family or a church context that is willing to say yes. And if I'm honest, it doesn't always work. We've had a lot of our church plants sometimes fail. But when they fail well, the leaders come back. They reintegrate into family. They maybe go through a healing process. And then in almost every case, they step back into significant leadership roles. And that's really beautiful. And so it's this sort of fluid approach of like, rather than saying, okay, let's raise $100,000 and do the big plant and, let's take the ground over there or there. I think it's more of a sort of a prophetic discernment process in the people of our church. And as a leadership team, we try to, have some strategic approach to it, try to think methodically about where are we going to plant. But fundamentally, it's not driven by us. It's driven by the people in our church that are putting up their hands to go. And it really comes down to where they feel the Lord calling them to go. And then we'll say, okay, let's try to resource that.
And because you've started with truly believing the priesthood of all believers, that as you said, everybody in this church could plant something, could be part of making disciples. If that's the call of the Christian life, is to go and make disciples who make disciples. You've started with that as the culture. Speak to someone who's listening today. This could be someone who's pastoring a church. They could maybe identify with your experience 5 years ago, where they are kind of looking at themselves in the mirror and they're saying, okay, we've got a crowd, but we're not making disciples, or your definition of discipleship is so far off the radar. And then speak to the person that's sensing and is in the process of planting a church. What would you say is a non-negotiable as they begin? So the established pastor, and then secondly, the starter.
So I think for the established context, I think that it's got to start with a personal experience and work of discipleship. Rather than trying to turn the whole ship around in one shot, although we did basically do that, I don't know that I would advise it in every case. I think start at home. Start by just saying, okay, I'm going to start discipling a group of guys or a group of girls, and 5, 10, 3, 2, but start with the intention of raising them up to lead their own. Would be my first encouragement. So, okay, I'm going to disciple 5 people, but within 3 months, I'd like one of that group to spin out a new group and start discipling another 5 people. I think that most of what we have learned, and I have learned in disciple making, I have learned in my own home, doing discipleship myself, doing evangelism myself, trying to articulate the gospel to somebody who's from a different culture, week in and week out and week in and week out, and just learn, and then raising that leader up, and then them having to be sent, and then figure out how I support them, would be my first encouragement. My second encouragement related to that is we've got to think about how do we get everybody into discipleship relationships. Oftentimes we think about the small group as sort of like people will join our church and we'll land them into small groups. But I think the future of the church is lots and lots of house churches, and having people land into the house churches and then connecting to the rest of the church is sort of flipping the approach. And that means that we've got to place that as a major priority. We don't have a small group or house church pastor or leader at Lift Church. We have everybody is on that portfolio. Like every team member is committed to that. So we've structured our team 100% to support the house church, every single team member. And then the third thing is, once we start to figure that out, every single team member needs to be engaged in discipleship and doing it themselves. Every worship leader, universally across the board. If we're serious about making disciples, we've got to work through at the top and start to work it down. If people in the church perceive that, the worship leader's not doing it, or the associate pastor, the executive pastor's not doing it, then they're not going to do it. So it's got to be a top-down modeling of this is what it looks like. And it will take possibly 5 years for that modeling to trickle down. So that would be to the established. To the new church, I just give yourself the permission of time and put Instagram away. Like, comparison is the death of everything. When we look at other churches and their perceived success, it's so easy to be demoralized. Oftentimes we plant churches and we're like just aiming at like being financially solvent. I think if we could take the financial pressure off, if there's a way to take the financial pressure off, not by having some rich person come in and fund it, but by finding a model that gives us time to just make disciples. A lot of our church planting methodology requires that we grow fast enough to generate large sums of income fairly quickly. And unfortunately, I think that comes at the expense of discipleship and evangelism, because we don't plan for a long enough time horizon. To lead someone to Christ and then get them contributing financially, that takes a long time. And that longer than a church plant will probably have in cash runway. And so I think if we can sort of think about church planting, especially if you're at the design phase, from this is going to take 5 years to maybe reach critical mass, but we're going to make disciple making and evangelism a priority. Okay, so that means that we got to think differently about the financial makeup of the church, and it's probably going to be non-traditional, but it's so much fun. half of my house church is people that have never, ever opened the Bible before. Just last night, I was hanging out with a guy and gave him his first Bible and taught him to read it. And he's baffled and overwhelmed and confused and interested all at the same time. And that's what this opens up, is the ability to do that, but at scale. And so, yeah, that's a lot of thoughts for the person starting out. Hopefully something that was helpful or valuable.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. We started our conversation today. As I said, I kind of started with the end in mind. As I said, this isn't the end of Lift Church. This is only the beginning of this discipleship movement that is happening. But the interesting thing is that we started with a building, but the real emphasis of this building is to leverage and to multiply disciples. That's the purpose of it. And something we also haven't mentioned is the fact that Lift Church predominantly emphasizes the reaching of college and university students. Mm-hmm. So it's not a number of individuals with deep pockets that have financed this building. This right. is a movement of young people committed to Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's right. I think that Matt, that points to I think the long term of what we're praying the Lord does. I was recently asked, like, where do we want to be in 50 years? You know, how many campuses do we want to be on? And as I thought about it, I said, Lift Church will one day die, probably. Human institutions don't last forever. They tend to stagnate. But what I pray we can do, and what I'm basically going to give the rest of my life to, is not building an institution or an organization, but hopefully building a people that have a way of life that is modeled after the scriptures. And those people live in community and are committed to disciple making and have committed to embodying the goodness of Jesus in real life-on-life relationships. And so what we're really trying to do is not build an institution, but build a people. And I think that's worth giving my life to, because that'll carry on way, way, way beyond. Whether or not those people bear the torch of Lift or somebody else, doesn't matter, because they're going to carry forward this heart of disciple making. And so, yeah, that's sort of what we hope this building and the work we're trying to do is like building a people that have a way of life that is modeled after Jesus.
Thank you, Robin, for taking the time today to have this conversation and imparting to me and to those who will listen to this the emphasis of this disciple making. It's evident in your life, and I thank you.
Thanks, Matt. It's a pleasure.
At the beginning of our episode today, I asked us to think about how we're making disciples. Robin and Lift Church is a great example of a church that is prioritizing disciple making in every decision that they make. And one of the reasons it's such an emphasis is because they have focused on everybody in their church sent to multiply everything. Robin used the term priesthood of all believers, and that originates in 1 Peter 2, verse 5, where we read, "You also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a royal priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." The passage goes on to say, "You are a chosen race, a holy nation, a royal priesthood." This text is getting to the reality that all of us, every single follower of Jesus, is a disciple, and all disciples are invited to go and make other disciples, to be involved in the disciple-making process. And far too often in our churches, and even the way we think about our church plants, we leave this up to paid professionals. Well, what if you, as the pastor, as the leader, as the church planter of your church, you as somebody who's part of your church planting team, or somebody just thinking about church in Canada, what would it look like for you to emphasize every single person in the church as a person that's been called by God to make disciples? And how would that shift in the way you think, change the way you interact with the church, with even yourself, and with the world around you. I hope you've been encouraged today, as I know I have been. Once again, would love for you to share this podcast at The Sowers Pod on Instagram, at The Sowers Pod on Twitter. And of course, if you have any questions, please mention us in those places or ask at thesowerspod.ca.